The word Appalachia is kind of like the word skinwalker. When you speak it, they will come. But in the case of Appalachia, it brings people from all sides of the world to tell me that I'm pronouncing it wrong. But I'm here to tell you, you should care more about the scary, creepy little things that are in Appalachia. The things that peek around tree trunks and get way too close to campers and hikers before they ever realize they're not alone anymore. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Today's episode features an assortment of scary, allegedly true stories of the unexplained, including 2 especially creepy Appalachian Mountains stories. If you want me to narrate your eyewitness account of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. If you want to help us grow, leave a follow and review of Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you must have more, consider becoming a member at eriecast.com/plus, where you can unlock access to exclusive members-only content. Now then, let's begin. Forgotten Trail from Leander R. Growing up in the Appalachian Mountains, I'd always been warned about the old trails. Some were safe, well-traveled paths that led to stunning overlooks. Others, my grandfather would say, were forgotten for a reason. When I was 16, my friends and I decided to take a shortcut through one of those abandoned trails to get to our campsite before dark. It was overgrown, barely a path anymore, but we went on, laughing at my grandfather's warnings. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. Birds stopped chirping. Even the rustling of leaves seemed to hush. And we soon noticed these carvings. They were symbols etched onto trees, deep and fresh, though some were faded with age. There were circles, spirals, strange figures with elongated limbs. None of us could understand them, but they all pointed in one direction: forward. By the time we realized we were lost, the sun had dipped below the mountains, and that's when the whispering began. At first it was faint, like the wind in the trees, but then it grew clearer. Voices murmuring just beyond the edge of our flashlights. We called out to it, thinking maybe it was someone messing with us. But there was no answer besides more whispering, and it started to circle us. Panic set in. We turned back the way we came, but the path was different, narrower, darker. The symbols on the trees had changed. Instead of abstract shapes, they now depicted human figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. And then we saw them. Tall, thin shadows, standing among the trees, barely visible, shifting whenever we tried to focus on them. One stepped closer to us. My friend screamed and bolted. We followed, crashing through the woods, running without direction. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking us with that distorted sound. Somehow we stumbled out of the woods onto an old dirt road. The trail was gone. No opening in the trees, no sign of the path we had taken. My friend was never the same after that night. He stopped talking to the rest of our friend group, and he even moved away a year later. I did my best not to think about it. Just last week, I went hiking with my girlfriend when I saw something carved into a tree near our cabin. One of those symbols, but it was freshly etched, and below it, in deep, jagged letters, was what looked to be my name. I don't think we were supposed to leave that night, and I don't think they ever stopped watching. A few nights later, I heard something outside our cabin. I thought it was the usual nighttime sounds at first, wind or the occasional cracking of a branch, the cabin settling, but I heard the familiar whispering, just outside the window. I lay there frozen, barely breathing. Sarah was asleep beside me, oblivious. I turned my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. Through the thin curtain, I could see the outline of something tall standing just beyond the trees. Someone watching. I shut my eyes as tight as I could, telling myself it wasn't real. I was just dreaming. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin, but they weren't normal. They were long and misshapen, like whatever had been out there wasn't entirely human, but maybe it was trying to appear so. The dirt was disturbed around the base of a nearby tree, and carved into its bark was a new message. "You left. We remember." I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't want to scare her. And I didn't know what they wanted. We left that night, and I pray I never hear them again. The Family Portal, from Fallen Oni. This is a story from when I was about 15. These events still stay with me and freak me out, and I'm genuinely wary of the dark wherever I go due to what happened in that house. I'm afraid it might happen again someday. One day, my dad decided that he wanted to hire a medium to come to the house to try to reconnect with some of our family members who had passed on. My mother was very much against this. At the time, I thought it was a good idea, because I also wanted closure with some of my family members. At the age of 8, I once woke up in the middle of the night in a panic without really knowing why. I stayed up for over an hour, feeling dread and not understanding why I felt something awful was going to happen. Eventually, I reluctantly fell back to sleep. The next morning, I was told my uncle had been in a freak accident and had died. I instantly started to bawl my eyes out, crying until I nearly threw up. It wasn't just because he was dead, but because I also knew something was going to happen. I just didn't know exactly what, and I had said nothing. It almost felt, though, like I had killed him. Of course, there was no way I could have known it would be him, or that something bad actually was going to happen. However, I learned years later that the time I woke up in a panic was about the same time he died, and I connected the dots. That wasn't the only time I had a premonition. When I was about 12, I was at school on the day before Valentine's Day. All the classes were celebrating with candy and movies, which was fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being sad, like someone was watching me too. I felt awkward and misplaced the entire day, not knowing why. After school, my mother picked me up, and my twin sister was with us as usual. But she told us we were going to our grandmother's house, which was highly unusual because we typically only went on weekends. As my mom kept driving, I asked her what had happened, knowing that something was wrong. She refused to tell me and just stared at me quietly through the rearview mirror. When we were about a block away, I heard my grandfather calling my name. It was just a whisper, but I swear to you I heard it. He had been in the hospital battling stage 4 spine cancer that was making its way up to his brain, and at that moment I realized my grandfather had passed on. It took everything in me not to cry, because I wasn't entirely sure yet, and I was afraid I was just making it up in my head. My sister still had no idea, so I stayed quiet. Eventually, when we arrived at our grandmother's house, my dad broke the news. My grandfather was dead. It was hard for my brothers and my sister. It was hard for me too, but I still refused to cry. I could feel my grandfather didn't want us to be sad. He had been fighting cancer for a very painful year, so I knew he was now happily at rest. My father couldn't understand why I wasn't upset. He looked at me and asked, "Are you okay?" I told him that I'd already known. Everyone looked at me confused, except my mother. My dad asked who told me, and I said no one. I just knew. I explained how I had felt throughout the day, and that I'd heard his voice. But my dad didn't believe me. He just glared at my mother, assuming that she had told us. He then asked my sister if she had known, and she said she had no idea. That proved my mother hadn't told us a word. About 3 months after he passed, I had a very vivid dream about my grandfather. I believe it was his way of saying a proper goodbye, since I hadn't seen him in over 6 months before he died. These were the reasons I wanted to have a session with the medium my dad hired. I wanted closure. However, my mother refused to let me or any of my siblings in the house during the session. She told us it wasn't safe and wouldn't be good for us. At the time, I had no idea how right she was. I begged and begged to have my own session, but my mother simply wouldn't budge. So I never did. Thankfully, I didn't, because what happened afterward was already horrible enough. I can't imagine what would have happened to me if I'd actually connected. After the medium left, everything seemed fine, but not for long. About 2 weeks later, there was a fly infestation on the second floor of the house in the kitchen, but only on one window. Sound familiar? It was bizarre. They only huddled on the window screen. There had to be hundreds of them, all huge, just under the size of horseflies. With so many of them, they almost sounded like cicadas. We had no idea where they'd come from, as if they had just appeared there. By the next day, most of them were dead, and the rest had disappeared. Obviously, this was strange, but at the time we had no idea what had happened. I believe this may have been where the portal was, and that the day of the fly infestation was the day it opened. After that day, I began to see and hear things throughout the house. It began with the shadow man in the corner of my room. This thing had to be about 8 feet tall, as its head was just under the doorframe. I could feel it watching me. It would only stand in that corner if it was dark, almost like it was trying to hide. But I knew it was there, because on the few occasions it wasn't, I could see the kitchen light, which we always left on, shining through the doorway. I didn't need to see it though, because I could feel it watching me. It felt very angry with me. It knew that I could see it, which upset it, but it was even more upset that I wouldn't leave. While I slept, my dreams were constant nightmares. I could hear an angry man screaming, "Get out! Get out!" trying to stop this. I slept with a cross under my bed, hoping it would help, but I think it only made things 10 times worse. After 3 nights, the cross disappeared without a trace. I pulled everything out of my room, my bed and dresser, and searched along the carpet where it met the floorboards. But I never found it. That made me sad because it was something my grandfather had given me. After losing the cross, the shadow man seemed to follow me everywhere. He was always in the corner of my eye, right behind my shoulder, no matter where I went in the house. I also started to have regular sleep paralysis episodes. I never really saw anything during the episodes though, but it always did take me almost a minute to move any part of my body. It happened so often, I developed a routine to break out of it as quickly as I could. One day, while I was doing the dishes, I noticed that the corner of my right eye was entirely black. I shifted my gaze, and I realized the figure was only a few inches away from me. That scared me. It was the closest it had ever been. I whipped around and started to scream at it. "Who are you? What do you want from me? Just leave me alone. I don't know who you are." Of course, as soon as I turned around, it vanished. But my screams were loud enough to bring my mother in from outside. She asked what happened. I gave her some weak excuse, which she didn't really believe. Looking back, I wish I'd told her the truth. Maybe she could have helped me. But at the time, I just felt crazy. How does a 15-year-old explain this? Especially when you don't think your parents will believe you. I barely even believed it myself. Surprisingly, the shadow man did as I asked. He stayed away, but always in sight. I could see him everywhere, always standing on the opposite side of the house, or in reflections, mirrors, TVs, anything reflective. The house had a very open concept, so you could see across it from one end to the other, even upstairs. After the screaming incident, other things started to happen. I began to see what people call a mimic, something that copies how someone looks or sounds. This one always mimicked my twin sister. The first time I saw it, I thought I was watching my sister walk from the stairwell into the living room with her music turned up too loud as usual. I went to the living room to talk to her and found no one there. I called her and asked where she was. She wasn't even home. She said she was at the doctor's office with our mom. Another time, I was talking to her in my room, and she sprayed one of those awful room sprays while chatting with me. A few seconds later, I heard something at the doorway and I looked over. There she was again. She walked into my room and sprayed the same spray, repeating the exact conversation we had just had only seconds ago. I told her she had just done that, but she denied it, saying I was seeing things. That encounter still creeps me out to this day. The scariest thing that happened to me in that house occurred when I was home alone with my 3 dogs. I was sitting in my room and heard heavy footsteps upstairs. Assuming there was an intruder, I grabbed a wooden bat we kept by the entryway. I also called one of my dogs, a Stafford Terrier mix who was extremely loyal to me. All I had to do was snap and he'd be by my side. Together, we went upstairs to search every inch of the place, but found no one. I decided I must have been paranoid, so I headed back downstairs. Suddenly, I heard this huge crash, and the other dogs began to bark. I ran down as fast as I could, bursting out of the stairwell. I saw my dogs barking at the floor in a circle. The hairs on their necks and tails were standing straight up. In the center of the circle was a coffee cup just sitting there with the coffee swirling around inside of it. Relieved that the cup wasn't broken, I picked it up and I started to walk toward the sink. As soon as I turned away, the stairwell door, which never really closed properly, just slammed shut behind me. Terrified, I threw the cup into the sink, grabbed all the dogs, and took them outside onto the deck. I sat there, not wanting to be in the house by myself anymore, afraid that if I stayed any longer it would hurt me. My family moved out about 2 years later. My dad said that he and his girlfriend had some encounters after my siblings and mom left, but they didn't experience half of what I went through in that house. After we moved, I told my dad what had happened to me. He felt bad, said that he wished he'd known. He never would have hired that medium if he had realized there were such consequences. From what I understand, anyone who buys the house after us never stays too long. It makes me believe the portal there is still open. Ever since I moved out, I haven't had any more dreams or sleep paralysis. I believe that when he hired the medium, they never closed the portal properly. My advice is this: never do anything like that in your own home. You have no idea what might come of it, or whom it might affect. Shadow in the Woods, from SabreSquidHD. This story takes place about 6 or 7 years ago. I would have been around 14 or 15. I live in the mid-Michigan area, not as heavily forested as northern Michigan, and not as urban as southern Michigan, but somewhere in between. There are some scattered cities, woodlands, farmland, and small towns. For context, I live in a trailer park off a road about 2 miles from any town, so it's a bit out in the country. Running alongside the road adjacent to the park are 2 ditches. One ditch goes for about 50 yards, then stops at one entrance. It's cut off by another entrance where the other ditch, which is bigger, starts. The larger ditch begins narrow, then opens into a decent-sized pond toward the back of the park. Near this ditch, there's a strip of woods that's really just a 200-yard trail lined by trees on both sides, connecting the edge of the park to the road. My brother lived here with our grandma when he was younger, and told me scary stories about those woods. Strange noises, weird finds in the dirt. Even once claimed he dug up a human skull, though I suspect that was just to scare me. He spoke of a shadow figure that supposedly lived in those woods, saying it's on old native land and could be cursed. Now that you have the layout and some background, here's the story. It was a warm, cloudy, and windy autumn afternoon. My friend Matthew and I used to go outside a lot, playing these army games using sticks as pretend guns. We never had fancy toy guns, so we used our imagination. The trailer park had a lot of empty, run-down trailers that no one lived in, but weren't yet removed, so it made for an interesting place to run around. Anyone who's played with stick guns knows how hard it is to find a really good stick. Once you do, you treasure it, making sure it doesn't break. On that specific day, I found one I liked, perfect for a rifle. But Matt was having trouble finding one big enough to be his machine gun. We had no luck around the park, so he suggested we go into the woods to look for sticks. Normally, we avoided those woods because they were creepy and the sticks there were often too twisted or awkward to use. But that day, we decided to check anyway. As we headed up the trail, I felt the air get heavy. It felt like we shouldn't be there, as if we were disturbing someone or something. The wind picked up, and because it was late fall, most of the leaves were gone. So the tall cottonwood trees whistled in a way that made everything more eerie. We walked about halfway into the woods, scanning the ground for sticks. I wasn't picking up much because I was worried about bugs, and honestly just wanted to leave. I had this constant feeling of dread, and I couldn't explain it. Meanwhile, Matt was digging through every pile of branches and fallen limbs, looking for his perfect gun. There's a small detail I should mention here. About halfway along the trail to the right, there's a little detached area we called an island. It's separated from the path by thick shrubs and branches with sharp needle-like protrusions. As Matt was sifting through a pile of sticks near this island, we noticed that all the nearby animals and birds had suddenly gone silent. We both spotted low-hanging branches ahead of us, which were shaking. It was like someone was jerking them around. And that's when we heard it, the crunch of leaves about 20 feet to my right. I looked over and saw, clear as day, this hunched-over shadow figure. It wasn't transparent, it was solid black, with a distinct hunched back. Its arms jutted out in front of it, and at the wrists, the hands dropped down like an animal's paws. It was running quickly in a bizarre tiptoe-like motion, barreling through the trees and shrubs as though they weren't even there. It felt like it had one goal: to chase us off its land. As soon as I saw it rushing towards us, I hit Matt on the shoulder and bolted, yelling, "Run!" Matt yelled something behind me, but my adrenaline took over, and all I cared about at that moment was getting out of there. We darted through the undergrowth, tripping over stumps and dodging branches until we finally emerged from the woods. I collapsed against a large tree, gasping for air. About 30 seconds later, Matt came bounding out, just as out of breath and totally confused as to why I'd taken off so suddenly like that. I told him about what I saw. He said he had stopped for a breath about halfway out, but he swore that he had heard something coming after us. He caught a glimpse of a figure moving both fast but also slow somehow at the same time. He didn't fully explain how that worked, and I didn't ask. To this day, neither of us knows what we encountered. but we're convinced that land, at least that strip of woods, is cursed or perhaps occupied by something that doesn't appreciate visitors. It very clearly did not want us there, and it made that very clear. Ghost Child Comes to Play. From Sneakattack. When I was much younger, I had an old friend I spent a lot of time with. He lived in one of those older homes in our hometown. Dark, ornate wood trim, fieldstone basement walls, and always a bit too quiet. Something about it never felt right to me. But as a kid, I didn't have the words to describe that uneasy feeling it gave off. Two events stand out in my memory, leaving me with a lingering sense of dread that I simply can't shake. The first incident happened while I was playing with my friend in their living room. Near the front door was an old painting on the wall. I'd passed this painting many times before, but for some reason, I was drawn to it that day, staring at it without really knowing why. The painting depicted a boy sitting on a wooden rocking horse, grinning, with one arm resting on the horse and the other raised near his head. Something about it was off. Then I noticed an air bubble in the paint, right where the boy's hand was, shaped like a knife. It wasn't part of the painting's design. It was definitely a raised bubble, protruding like it had been added. I showed it to my friend, and we both stared at it for a while. I thought it was just a weird flaw, maybe from age, but it was a little bit too precise in shape and position. I remember my friend shrugging and saying to me, "Weird stuff like that always happens here, but I'm used to it." That comment bothered me, but I tried not to let it scare me. Later on, my mom picked me up and I went home, not planning to think about that painting again. However, when I came back the next day, the knife shape was gone, like it had never been there at all. Even more disturbing, the child in the painting no longer had a grin. His face looked blank, as if he were posing for a solemn photo. I still have no explanation for that, but I can't forget how it made me feel. A few years later, I found myself babysitting in the same house one night. I was in the living room watching a movie with the younger kid that I was looking after. Suddenly, I heard the doors upstairs slam shut one after another. Bang, bang, bang. It didn't sound like wind or a random draft. It was too deliberate. Normally, I would have run out of the house. I'm a bit of a coward, but I couldn't leave the child alone. Gathering my courage, I crept upstairs to go check, turning on every light. All the doors were standing open. It made no sense. I felt some momentary relief until I saw the family dog at the front door, completely still, staring at something outside. The dog's posture was tense, ears back, and it started to growl. A fearful growl, not an angry one. And then I noticed the basement door. There's a window on that door, which lines up with a window to the outside. For some reason, I looked in that direction, and I saw the face of a boy. Just for a split second. It wasn't someone kneeling and peering in. Rather, it was a disembodied head. Eyes turned upward, like the rest of the body was buried underground. Then it vanished. It didn't move away, it simply ceased to exist. My heart stopped, and every hair on my neck stood up. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the boy in the painting had come back to play. After that, I avoided staying in that house. The unease never left me. There was definitely something there, and it wasn't just my friend and his family who lived in that home. To this day, I still wonder who or what was really inside those walls. Why is she following me? From Bethy555. I'll start by saying I never believed in the supernatural or paranormal. Yet, the things I'm about to share have been happening to me since around 2009. My wife is a huge fan of the show, and she suggested I share my experiences here to see if anyone else can relate or offer an explanation. I'm Mason. I'm from a small town in Alabama. The first time I saw her was during my senior year of high school. I call her because I don't know who the lady is, and she initially appeared only in my dreams. It was around April of 2009, and like every senior, I was excited to graduate and move on with my life. My parents had been divorced since I was in elementary school, so I lived with my mom and visited my dad on weekends. My sister, who's 6 years older than me, had already moved out by then. During my senior year, I moved in with my dad because it was closer to my school and job. He had remarried, and my stepmom had 2 kids, a daughter a few years older than me, and a son about the same age, almost to the day. My stepbrother and I shared a room. He was often gone with friends or his girlfriend, so I usually had the room to myself. One night, my stepbrother was staying over at a friend's house. After working until 10 p.m. on a Friday, I came home, took a shower, and flopped onto bed. I remember falling asleep with the light on. Then I started to dream. But it felt different, more vivid than any dream I'd ever had. In it, I was in my high school gym, walking toward the locker room. I heard a girl crying and followed the sound into the shower area. All the showers were running, and in the middle stood a girl with long black hair covering her face, sobbing. My first thought was, why is a girl in the boys' locker room? But I kept going. I reached out and put my hand on her shoulder, and as soon as I touched her, she shot upright. She had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets. I stumbled backward in horror, and I woke up. I sprang upright so fast I nearly fell out of my bed. I realized then the room was pitch dark. I knew for a fact I'd left the light on when I fell asleep. Panicking, I stood up, and I saw across my room a dark mass. I couldn't make out any details beyond its long hair. I tried flipping the light switch, but it didn't work. I even punched myself to make sure I wasn't still dreaming. The figure just stood there. I stayed awake until sunrise, too scared to close my eyes again. Fast forward a few years. I had my own apartment, living with my now wife. We shared a king-sized bed with our 2 dogs, so I usually ended up on a sliver of the mattress. One night, around 4 a.m., I got up to go use the bathroom. Afterwards, I crawled back into bed and went to sleep. I tend to sleep on my side, so I rolled over to face the wall, which is also the direction of the slightly ajar bedroom door. We leave it cracked for our dogs. It was dark in the room, but I opened my eyes just a bit. And there she was again, right by the side of my bed, long hair covering her face, hovering over me. I jolted up, accidentally knocking our small Yorkie off the bed. I felt terrible about it later. I switched on the light, waking my wife and our other dog, a big German Shepherd. The woman vanished the second the room lit up. My wife, who already believed in strange phenomena, asked what happened. I told her everything, and afterwards we both stayed awake, unsettled. The last sighting was the worst. It happened in December of 2024. I work half an hour away from my home on 3rd shift. My wife also works 3rd shift, but in a different area of the plant, so we usually ride home together. That night, she was sick and had to stay home, so I had to drive alone in the dark. I have to take this back road route to work. About halfway there, I approached what we call the double bridge, 2 small bridges over a large river. My wife hates this stretch at night. She usually closes her eyes until we're across, but I'd never had a problem with it until that night. Something felt wrong, and I assumed it was just because of my usual routine being interrupted. I crossed the first bridge without incident. Approaching the second, I saw what looked like a person in the middle of the road. I slowed down, thinking maybe someone's car had broken down. There was no vehicle in sight, though. As I got closer, I realized it was her. This time, her face was not hidden by her hair. Her mouth was wide open, like in a silent scream. Panic shot through me. I floored the accelerator then, and as I sped past her, I heard the most unearthly scream, like a banshee mixed with a mountain lion. I've never heard anything quite like it. I didn't stop until I reached work, where I immediately called my wife. That entire night, I was on edge, jumping at every small noise. The next morning, I dreaded driving home, but at least it was daylight. I crossed those bridges again, going as quickly as I could. I haven't seen her since, but my anxiety is through the roof, because there's no pattern to her appearances. The dream was one thing, but seeing her in my room, and then hearing that horrific scream, was something else entirely. Who is she? What does she want from me? Does anyone out there have an explanation or a similar experience? I just want her to leave me alone. Appalachian Terror from BuckStop. I've spent my entire life in a small Appalachian town tucked into a valley that's flanked by rolling hills and steep ridges. The place where everyone knows everyone else. I'm sure you've heard that before. You could at least say everyone knows a story about everyone else. My family has lived here for generations, which means our name is inextricably linked with the ridges, creeks, and old cabins that dot the landscape. Growing up, I was always a child of the outdoors. Fishing and hunting and hiking were my pastimes. As soon as I could walk, my grandfather would take me along the foothills, teaching me to look for signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud and tufts of fur on broken branches. When I was old enough to explore on my own, I made a habit of wandering even deeper into those woods, never thinking much of the legends that we told, the ones locals would whisper around bonfires. But I will tell you about them. I remember stories about strange silhouettes people would see just around sunset, eerie lights that flickered at the tops of ridges and disappeared with no explanation. You would hear one person say they heard chanting out there, and another would see footprints that couldn't have come from any known animal. I listened from time to time, amused by how people would get worked up out in the forest and think they saw things. After all, these mountains are rife with wildlife and illusions. If you're creeped out enough, a gentle rustle in the leaves from wind or a doe could quickly become the sound of being chased. I never believed the stories. I thought their true causes were always something grounded. But that was before one fall. I was forced to confront the idea that maybe not everything out there can be explained away. It was a Saturday. The air had a biting chill to it. The leaves had already begun to turn shades of russet and gold, and I decided to spend the day hiking up a ridge, which I referred to as High Pine Peak. This is not an official name, but something my childhood friends and I grew up with. We called it that because the summit was known for these two massive pine trees near the top, which stand out among all the deciduous oaks and maples. I wanted to get some photographs of the autumn foliage before the season ended, maybe catch a sunset if I timed it right. I set out around noon with my usual gear. I'd planned a route that would take me along the eastern side of the ridge, where an old overgrown logging trail wound through hollows and gullies. That trail eventually connected to a steeper path near the top, which would lead me around the boulder-strewn summit. I'd done it before plenty of times, so I was confident I could do it again. The first couple of hours were peaceful. The trees were absolutely stunning, too. Some of them had already lost many leaves, creating a crackling carpet of reds, oranges, and yellows. Here and there, a squirrel darted across the trail, sending a scattering of leaves flying. Eventually, I reached a section of the trail where the trees grew denser, and the canopy blocked more of the light. The air grew noticeably cooler, and a light mist began to drift between the trunks. This was typical for the Appalachian high ridges in fall. Pockets of fog can settle in the hollows, even on an otherwise clear day. Despite having grown up here, the sudden hush and creeping fog had always felt creepy to me. When it happened, my footsteps always seemed too loud, and every snap of a twig made me flinch or jump. I stopped for a while to drink some coffee from my thermos. I used a mossy rock as a makeshift seat. I couldn't help but think about these stories I'd heard then, reminding myself that no matter how eerie it got out here, I wasn't about to mistake a shadow for a mysterious beast, or wind for ghostly whispers. Satisfied with my break, I stood up and continued on. I was planning to reach the steeper trail within the hour. That was when I noticed something unusual in the distance, off to my left. It was just a flicker of movement between the thicker trunks. At first, I assumed it was a black bear. I even caught a glimpse of dark limbs. But as I tried to focus on it, the movement stopped, and the figure disappeared. I shrugged it off, thinking at most, cool, I saw a black bear. I made a mental note to keep a wide berth from any bears I saw. About a half-mile further, the logging trail curved around a slope. The brush on either side was overgrown, but the path itself was mostly clear. I slowed down when I saw something lying about 30 feet ahead. Looked like a fallen branch or a log. As I approached, I realized it wasn't a branch. It was a cluster of broken limbs. They were snapped in a strangely deliberate-looking way, arranged almost like a crude barrier. There were no cutting marks or sawing marks. No, it looked like they'd been twisted or broken by force. Maybe some strong winds had come through recently. Then again, it looked to have been constructed, not accidental. And when I looked up, none of the branches near me were broken. These were collected and put here. Sometimes local kids would pull pranks or set up things like this for whatever reason. But we were far away from any frequently traveled route, and kids rarely come this deep into the woods alone. I stepped around the pile. I wanted to kick it or dismantle it, but something inside told me to just leave it alone. So I continued along the trail. Sure, it was a bit unsettling, but mostly it was fascinating. About 20 minutes later, I reached an open stretch of trail that offered a view of the surrounding ridges whenever there wasn't fog. That day, though, a pale haze clung to the valleys, making it hard to see more than a mile or so. The sky was clouding over, and the temperature seemed to drop another few degrees. I was thinking of turning back then. Then I spotted it. There was a figure standing near the crest of the slope, maybe 70 yards ahead. They seemed to be standing upright, but with an off posture, perhaps hunched. Whatever it was, or whoever they were, they looked unusually tall and thin. It wore some kind of dark, ragged covering that might have been clothing, or perhaps just a wrap of fur or leaves. I couldn't be sure at this distance. My mind scrambled to come up with an explanation. A hiker with a large backpack, a hunter wearing camouflage. But the figure didn't move like a person. It took a step sideways, then another, in a way that reminded me of how a heron might move along a riverbank. As I watched, the figure shifted and glided out of view behind a cluster of mountain laurel. I say glided here because that's truly what it looked like from there. No heavy footfalls, no bending of the knees like a typical walk. I stayed rooted to the spot for maybe 30 seconds. Was I seeing things? Did I just see that right? Maybe it was a trick of the fog and my imagination. The part of me that demanded a rational explanation insisted I follow it and get closer. For all I knew, it could be a lost hiker or a local hermit who didn't want to be disturbed. But if I saw it up close, I could rest easy. I've always been pragmatic, but also stubbornly curious. Against my better instincts, I shouldered my backpack. I took a deep breath and made my way up the slope, where I'd last seen the figure. But I didn't find any footprints, just damp leaves. The leaves, though, did look like they'd been disturbed in a path heading westward. I then followed the trail of scuffed foliage, watching carefully for any more movement. After about 5 minutes, I came to a large rocky outcrop where the mountain laurel grew thick. It was almost like a natural wall. I wondered how the figure could have possibly slipped through without me hearing branches crack, or at least me seeing them sway. The laurel was dense, and moving through it would have made a tremendous amount of noise. And yet I heard nothing. I pressed around the outcrop and found a narrow gap, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. My jacket snagged on a branch, making a loud tearing sound. The gap led to a small clearing, a hidden hollow with a flat moss-covered rock at the center, and a ring of stunted oak trees around its perimeter. The air in that hollow was dead still. I heard no wind or bird calls. The ground felt oddly spongy, too, beneath my boots. I cautiously advanced, looking left and right, but there was no sign of anyone else or anything else. Before long, though, I did see it. It was crouched at the far edge of the clearing near the trunk of an oak. It was definitely tall, well over 6 feet, maybe closer to 7. Thin limbs with proportions that didn't seem quite human, and the covering it wore, or grew from its body, hung in dark tatters. As I stood there, it slowly turned its head toward me. I couldn't see a face exactly, more like an elongated shape with ridges where a skull should have been. Yet, I had the unmistakable impression that it was watching me with intense scrutiny. My blood pounded in my ears. I felt an overwhelming, instinctual urge to run, but also a strange pull to keep observing. I held my breath, and for a moment, I was thinking about saying something to it. But I decided against that. The creature, I struggled to call it a person, seemed wary of me, almost as if it was ready to sprint away if I made any sudden moves. The idea emboldened me a bit. Maybe it wasn't aggressive. Maybe I had the upper hand here. I took a half step forward. It instantly sprang upright. It made no sound that I could hear, but its movements were swift and smooth, reminding me of a deer spooked by a hunter's approach. It then darted along the edge of the clearing, weaving between trees so gracefully. I had to follow it, though, as quickly as I could. Branches scraped at my arms, and I stumbled over some roots. In seconds, however, it was gone, vanished into the thicker part of the woods on the far side of the clearing. I stood there, breathing hard, feeling like I'd lost my chance to figure out what I was dealing with, my chance for an explanation and comfort. Every rational thought in me was telling me that I'd just chased a figure that might be dangerous. But my dumb self felt compelled to keep going, telling myself it was just a person, definitely a weird-looking hermit, that was harmless, and if I just got close enough, I would see a human face and there would be no problem. After a few moments to catch my breath, I pressed on. The terrain grew steeper as I reached the upper ridges, and the ground was scattered with loose stones. The old-growth forest was much more dense here, with massive pines, oaks, and maples. It was near the crest of the hill, only about another 200 yards to the top, but the route had no clear trail. I had to pick my way around fallen logs and lichen-covered boulders. I started to notice small signs. Branches snapped off in ways that seemed intentional, scratch marks on tree trunks, and once a faint footprint in the wet soil. The footprint resembled a person's. Enough. Even so, something about it gave me shivers. I pushed on, convinced I was close to discovering something mundane. Eventually, I emerged on a narrow rocky ledge that offered a view of the next valley over. Normally, from there you could see farmland, a winding 2-lane road, the distant roofs of houses. But the fog had thickened, cloaking everything in milky gray. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of damp earth and leafy decay. I reoriented myself, then saw movement near a stand of those massive pine trees that gave this peak its local name, High Pine Peak. There it was again. The figure stood among the pines, one thin limb resting against a trunk. It was like it was trying to hide, except it was nearly the same dark color as the bark, so it didn't blend as seamlessly as it might have hoped. As I stepped forward, it jerked away, disappearing behind the tree. Despite my fear, I advanced. Rain was starting to patter down, lightly at first. It didn't take long for the ground to get slick. I nearly lost my footing twice. By the time I reached the 2 tall pines, the drizzle had turned into a steady shower, and dusk was closing in earlier than I'd expected. I had maybe an hour of usable light left, if that. My mind told me I should turn around then. Descending the ridge in the dark would be risky, especially on the unstable ground. But I couldn't shake my curiosity. I circled the pines, then called out. "Hello? Anyone out there?" My voice sounded pathetically small in the hushed forest, drowned out by the rain. There was no response. Another swirl of fog drifted in, making it impossible to see more than 20 feet ahead of me. Then, from somewhere close by, I heard a faint, rasping moan. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. It sounded almost pained, maybe afraid. But my stomach still lurched. I followed the sound, heart in my throat, until I found a shallow depression in the ground. It was partially sheltered by the roots of an enormous pine that clung to the rocky slope. Beneath that root was a space, a kind of hollow that might have been formed by erosion. Strewn across the ground were broken sticks, old animal bones, and a few strips of decaying cloth. The smell of damp fur and rot was in the air. I squinted in the dim light. I saw something crouching at the back of this hollow. My eyes struggled to interpret the shape. It looked like the thing I'd been chasing, curled up in on itself, as if hurt or exhausted or scared. There was an elongated arm, or maybe a leg. It was hard to tell. Whatever it was bent at an awkward angle. A cluster of small, pale bones lay near its side. The creature, or emaciated person, or whatever it was, lifted its head slightly, meeting my gaze with what I can only describe as a sorrowful intensity. I froze. No words formed in my mind. I felt a primal electric jolt of terror, but also a profound empathy, like I was confronting a wounded animal that could lash out if I approached. In that moment, I had no illusions anymore about it being human. I know that no human being had limbs like that, or eyes like that. The creature let out a low moan. My instincts screamed, "Leave now," but something held me in place. Carefully, I began to reach out to it. I was intent on touching it. I don't know what compelled me, but I felt I had to. The creature suddenly shrieked, a shrill warbling sound that made my skin crawl. It recoiled into the dark, and my heart nearly stopped. I staggered backward, slipping on the slick ground. At that moment, I knew I had to leave. There was no question about it. I'd pushed too far, intruded on something that had no interest in being discovered, and now I'd caused it pain or fear. I scrambled up the muddy slope, desperate to put some distance between us. At one point in my mad dash away, I crashed through a patch of brambles, ripping my pants. I felt a sting of blood on my calf, but barely registered it. It seemed like forever before I finally found a familiar landmark, a massive oak with twisted roots that I recognized from the logging trail. I felt so relieved, but I still felt exposed, like there were eyes on me in every direction. The final stretch of trail was a blur. I recall the rain intensifying and thunder rumbling in the distance. Of course, I nearly lost my footing a dozen more times. At long last, I emerged onto the country road that led back to town. My clothes were soaked and I was trembling. Couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from panic. I'd only been gone about 7 hours total, but it felt like I was gone a lifetime out there. When I got home, I locked myself in my bedroom and tried to sleep. And for a long time, I had nightmares about it. Nightmares where I'm standing at the edge of the hollow, shining my flashlight inside that hole, only to see two reflective eyes staring back. A few times, though, I've dreamed I was the wounded one in the hollow, and that elongated figure towers over me, deciding whether to help me or harm me. Many who live in Appalachia say these mountains hold secrets far older than our towns, older than the roads and the rail lines. At first, I always thought it was just poetic talk. Now I'm starting to rethink things. I suspect maybe I've glimpsed one of those secrets. A creature that moves quietly among the pines and laurel. Shy, maybe even wounded. What its purpose is, I'm not sure. But I am sure that there's something unnatural and otherworldly about it. Don't go chasing the things that go bump, especially the ones that want to be left alone. Well, that's interesting. This episode might be the only episode ever where someone chose to voluntarily chase a cryptid down and proceed to reach out and attempt to touch it. Probably not the best idea. If I was cornered and you tried to touch me, I'm gonna start biting. That brings us to the end of this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Thank you for tuning in. If you want me to narrate your story, send it to me at darkstories.org. If you want to support the show, consider becoming a member at eeriecast.com/plus, where you can unlock access to members-only content. And most importantly, if you have a moment, please follow and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Each one is a step closer to Unexplained Encounters becoming the biggest scary show on Earth. Thank you. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.